In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is born. Today we hear this very lengthy recounting of who was married to who, and who was the next generation down the line, all the way to the point of Joseph, where we see that Joseph is one of the people on this day, the day before Christmas, that we put some of our focus on because of the fact that he had a very integral part of the birth of Christ, but we don't hear much about him in the Bible. It's a short amount of time that we hear about his life, and then after the birth of Christ, he just kind of disappears off the pages of the Bible. And we might think, what happened to him? Why is that so? What was the story of his life? But one of the things that I wanted you to think about today, when we think about Joseph, when we see any type of nativity scene, he's always there. Whether it's an ornament with the Holy Family, as it's called, where it's the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and then Joseph standing there, or whether it's a full-blown, full-size nativity, we see Joseph there, and then we don't see him again. Does that make it wrong? Does that make it bad? No, not at all. But what Joseph's life says beyond what we typically see him standing at the birth of Christ is that he was questioning in his heart and in his mind, just like all of us do. We all have questions about the church. We have questions about life in general. We have questions about death. We have questions about science. We have all these different questions, and they kind of come and go, those questions. Sometimes we get them answered, and today, in today's day and age, it's very easy to get many things answered much quicker than years ago. But Joseph had a lot of questionings. Why me? Why am I supposed to do this? Why is this one that I'm supposed to take care of, this virgin from the temple that I'm supposed to take care of? And not marry in the sense of the word that we think marriage is today, but to take care of the Virgin Mary. Why now is she pregnant? How did she have this baby? And so questionings rise in his heart again. And we see that it's written that questionings rose in his heart. And he said, I'll divorce her quietly. In other words, I'm not going to make a big scandal. She's pregnant. I'll just kind of divorce her. And then the angel comes and says, no, you're supposed to take care of her because she is a virgin. She is the Virgin Mary, and she will have this Christ child that will be born, and you will be the caretaker. You will be the one who leads and follows the commands of God. So Joseph's life was very quiet. We don't hear a lot of dialogue really at all from him. What can you think that you heard from Joseph that you could recall from your mind from the Gospels? We think of, the different saints. We think of St. Paul. We think of Christ himself. We think of St. Peter. We think of the apostles when they were with Christ, and they're all talking, and they're like, hey, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Or we think of Christ speaking so many times to people. And even common non-saint figures in the Bible, we hear their dialogue. We hear this rich lawyer that comes to Christ to put him to the test, and we hear the whole of that conversation captured in the gospel. But do we hear this whole of the conversation with Joseph? Do we hear this dialogue with the Virgin Mary? Come on, we're going to go do this. No, it's very quiet, and he had a very quiet life. And it says that his quietness, even the fact that he was going to say to the Virgin Mary, let me divorce her quietly. Let me just step out of this, and she can go her own way, and I'll just go back to my quiet life. He didn't do that. He listened to the command of the angels, and the angels and the visions that he had were the ones that were directing him. Go. Here, he goes. Go there, he goes. After the birth of Christ, they leave. Before the birth of Christ, he goes in. Now, take the child, go here, go there. So he's being directed by God, and we hear of those encounters, but we don't hear really of this detailed dialogue of Joseph with the angels, or Joseph with the Virgin Mary, or Joseph even with Christ. But what's his life mean to us? Many of the saints on the wall in the church and in the compendium of the saints of the church, we hear a lot about what they wrote, what they did, what they said, where they went, all these types of things. And even St. Athanasius, our patron saint of our church, writes one of the greatest lines of Christmas ever. And he says that Christ became like us, God became like man, so that man can become like God. And that is really on his writing on the incarnation. So if you didn't know, one thing to take home today is that St. Athanasius wrote the standard work, the main body of work on the incarnation of Christ. In other words, the becoming of flesh of Christ. So he is the one who wrote the totality of the great theological writings of the Nativity of Christ. But we hear many of the saints say different things, write different things. But Joseph's life, for us, can be a great example. It can be an example that we don't have to have great writings. We don't have to be great orators. We don't have to be great speakers and go out and change the world in this grand way. But just to listen to the command of God, to be prayerful, and to follow God's directions. That's what we're all called to do. And Joseph becomes, as the Virgin Mary was a model of what the greatness of humanity can do through purity, Joseph becomes a model and an example for us of what humanity can become through being quiet, having a quiet life. Not a grand life and one, but just a simple, ordinary life that Joseph had. He becomes a saint that is forever in the history of the church, forever depicted at the birth of Christ. There is not an icon, there is not really a nativity scene anywhere that is missing Joseph, because he had a critical part of leading the Virgin Mary and leading and protecting Christ as a small child. But he did it quietly, he did it prayerfully, and he did it listening to what God was telling him to do, and changed his plans according to the will of God and according to the direction of God. So in our lives, what does this say for us? Is that we can be who we are, the non-great speakers or the non-great writers in the church, and we can say that praying and focusing on God in the context of the church and in our homes and in our daily lives, that God too can direct our lives closer to him, and that we can be sanctified and have this beautiful life in the presence of Christ, simply, quietly, and he becomes the great example for that. So as you think of Joseph, think of the things that he questioned, and realize that our questionings are normal too. And the icon of the nativity in the back that you'll see Joseph, and he's sitting there like this in the bottom corner of the icon, and he's thinking, what is this? What is going on? And how many of us in our daily lives have said, what's going on? What is today? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening in the world? But prayerfully, we get the direction and the guidance that gives us not only understanding, but also helps us to become closer to God. So may St. Joseph, the betrothed, continue to be an example for us, especially on this eve of Nativity. Amen.